Okay, so to start, professing. So I find myself in a little bit of a state of discomfort having to do this. I've been asked to do this inaugural lecture, which sort of confronts me with this slightly thorny question of what exactly is it that I profess. Now, I've heard a lot of phrases, some of you may have heard this too, bandied around the university along the lines of, what's your grand theory? Some of you may remember this was a favorite one of a former head of college. When I hear that, I'm left with the not unfamiliar feeling that the usual academic expectations and customs might be a slightly uncomfortable fit for me in what I do. I consider myself, though, first of all, to be a musician. An unconventional one, maybe, but a musician nevertheless. Some of you are doubtless familiar with the occasionally contentious discussions around the place of creative practice within research culture and academia at large. I'm not going to go into that in any detail, but suffice it to say that I remain a fervent believer in the value of creativity in all aspects of life. And I would include in that even, and maybe especially, administration, where you could probably use a little more creativity in that. So I'm going to proceed now to speak as an artist, and I'm going to do this in the hope that this talk, maybe in some small way, can actually also be a piece of art, with all the messy and wonderful qualities of beauty, imprecision, and inconclusiveness that might imply. I'm afraid I'm not going to offer any great truths I have found, or at least not directly. I am at this point rather less sure of those than ever, and I suspect whatever I have to offer as a unique contribution to knowledge, to co-opt a university phrase, probably resists simple expression in words. Now, it is true that some artists become known for their thing that they do. I don't think I've ever been that kind of artist. An unkind observer might say that I have a short attention span going around doing lots of different things. But I've always been led on by curiosity regarding new possibilities and a healthy, or at least that's what I tell myself, enthusiasm for new challenges. I sometimes do wonder if this lack of a defining focus has been good for my career, academic or otherwise. But in the end, I think we are ourselves, and we must accept the richness and the poverty that our choices entail in turn. For me, those choices have meant more of a wandering around music's garden, I'd say, than a walking a straight path. What my years of exploration and musical wanderlust have given me is an ever-increasing and ever-renewed sense of wonder at the unknowable range of musical creativity and the endless questions it raises. This has led me as a musician to an odd mix of change, both with and through repetition, somehow always not never doing the same thing again, which is the title of the talk. In doing this, I have learned a great deal, though this is not always easy to explain, as I alluded to a moment ago. Knowledge, after all, can take many forms. If composing music is a form of thought, musical thinking, if you like, then a piece of music, like a text, must itself be a form of embodied knowledge. And through music and words, one might, after all, profess many more things than facts and arguments as traditionally understood. One can profess feeling, belief, and even love, and many other things. Those of you who know me know I'm, for better or for worse, quite fond of tangents. So I'm going to take you on a journey, not from here to there, but rather on a series of diversions without an overall destination. Yes, I'm going to talk for the better part of an hour about my short attention span. Sorry. I'll tell you about some things in music and art that I love, in the hopes that they might, again, indirectly be in some small way as enriching for you as they have been for me. So much of my work and research has revolved around the use of computers in a variety of facets. While computer music was certainly well established before I came on the scene, I think of myself as fortunate to have arrived at a moment when real-time computer music systems came into their own, both in terms of hardware capabilities and language design. This presented an appealing context, both research and artistic, within which I could explore some of the new possibilities and challenges I mentioned above. But what does that mean? Firstly, I should stress that this really was, for me at least, about computer languages and code. Normal sorts of software with fixed user interfaces, of course, play a role in enabling somewhat defined and delimited tasks. Used modularly in combination, such software allows for considerable creativity and of course can also be subverted from its intended uses. I have and still do work in this way, but for me, nothing really approaches the flexibility of the relatively open canvas of code and a programming language. If that kind of statement seems quite utopian, indulge me for a moment. A critique of that sort of thing is coming. I say canvas rather than a workshop, though of course what I am talking about is in some sense tool building, or maybe instrument building if you prefer a musical model. But what matters is not the tools themselves, but the ideas behind them, the algorithms that they manifest. I am reminded of this quote from the semi-serious and somewhat infamous Top Lap Manifesto, which provocatively offered a justification for coding in performance as an artistic practice. Live coding is not about tools. Algorithms are thoughts. Chainsaws are tools. That's why algorithms are sometimes harder to notice than chainsaws. Algorithms are thoughts because, like thoughts imparted through words, they can be expressed in more than one language. But as with natural languages, we should not conclude from this that computer language design is neutral. Computer science offers us the notion of a language being Turing complete. Now that's a complicated concept. I'm not going to go too much into it, but in simple terms, a Turing-complete language can implement any algorithm. Thus, all Turing-complete languages can be said to be Turing equivalent. So far, so good. But the computer scientist Alan Perlis, in his famous Epigrams, wrote, "Beware of the Turing tar pit, in which everything is possible, but nothing of interest is easy." So, when we make languages, we have to choose what's easy to express and what is not. What do we make it easy to do, and what are the implications of those choices in terms of what then becomes more difficult or awkward? These are the trade-offs of language design, and can be especially enabling or problematic in domain-specific languages, by which I mean those focused on a specific area or task, such as music making. I've been very fortunate to be involved for more than 20 years with the music and DSP language SuperCollider, both as a user and a member of its development community. We did this lovely book some years ago and working on the second edition now. This has enabled much of my creative and research work, but perhaps more profoundly has put me on a path of reflection about those very trade-offs that I mentioned, and through that the nature of code, automation, and interfaces. This changed the way that I think about making music, or, if I can be forgiven a little rhetorical recursion, even how I think about thinking about making music. Algorithms and code can sometimes allow us to express a musical thought in a more powerful and expressive way than other media, such as descriptive prose or musical notation. For me, this potential was deeply seductive and has led to the gradual integration of code and programming into almost all areas of my musical practice, including live electronic music, fixed media electroacoustic pieces, instrumental composition, sound installations, etc. These issues are perhaps particularly salient in the area of live coding, a practice that I've been involved in most extensively through my activities leading the Birmingham Ensemble for Electroacoustic Research since 2011. Live coding is sometimes defined rather enigmatically as the process of writing programs to produce music that can be rewritten while they are running. In truth, it's probably more accurate to say that it's about swapping in various algorithms on the fly while they're running. As you might have guessed, you were watching an example of this over the last few minutes. There is a trade-off here, though. Again, code as interface is potentially very, very expressive. But it's not necessarily a very fast way to work, right? To go back to this idea of critiquing a utopian perspective on this, you can, in inverted commas, do anything you want. We can question whether that's really true, but people say things like that. But you can't always do it quickly. This makes live coding perhaps different from other forms of musical improvisation. You are often forced, out of necessity, to develop new musical ideas over the mid to long term. And the example I would give, if you're a pianist and you're just improvising with somebody, you're probably thinking about what you're doing now, whereas or in a few seconds. If you're live coding, you might be thinking about what you're doing in 10 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute from now, because it might take you that long to kind of get it up and running. This places live coding perhaps somewhere between the out-of-time practice of composition and more traditional approaches to improvisation, and that kind of quality really somehow suits my musical predilections. As I noted above, code has found its way into wide areas of my practice, both live and, well, dead doesn't seem quite the right word, but let's say more fixed compositions. And this has included work which enabled flexible real-time interactions between performers and computer-controlled electronic elements. For example, the highly interactive piano piece on the impossibility of reflection, a collaboration with the pianist Zenia Pestova. This was some little sort of bonus tracks that we did for the CD that were kind of associated with this, but you can just hear a little bit how the computer's maybe playing along with her and responding and reflecting. And this also includes more straightforward works combining live electroacoustics and sometimes video with instrumental performers in different ways. One particularly notable example of this kind of work is my piece for large orchestra, multi-channel electroacoustics and computer-generated video called Dark Matter. This grew out of a long-running eponymous project with Beer that involved taking data from the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, the world's largest particle accelerator, and sonifying it. That is, using algorithms to convert data into sound in a manner analogous to visualization, although in this case with a more artistic kind of idea or approach rather than trying to represent the data in some sort of information imparting way. The orchestra piece, while fixed in a sense, so it's not live coded, adapted approaches we developed through live coding to produce the electroacoustic and the instrumental music. The overall project was important to me in challenging the notions of abstract musical discourse that my education had pushed on me. This is something that we used to talk about a lot, the sort of 19th century ideas of music that's about something and music that's pure music. This really convinced me of the rich potential for enhancing meaningfulness that is offered by grounding artistic works in the real world. In this case, this was through a collaboration with science, and I have to say I was really amazed at the way in which a kind of aestheticized and at times poetic presentation of something as remote from most people's lives as particle collision data made the research somehow more tangible for them, profound and beautiful for some people in the audience, at least for some of them anyway. For myself, live coding has given me a core to my practice of electroacoustic improvisation, a workshop to create new ideas, including, helpfully for me, at times in my career when traditional composing was more difficult to accommodate just because I was too busy or too many other things were going on. And also an easy path to collaborate with other musicians, coding musicians or otherwise, in kind of ever-expanding musical networks. Indeed, Beer's particular focus has not been on live coding as coding, but rather on using it as a framework for structured improvisation implemented through network technologies. To give you some context for this, in the wake of the development of free jazz or free improvisation as a cultural phenomenon, one line of exploration that has arisen has been to explore ways out of its own tar pit, if you like. And I'm thinking here of musicians such as John Zorn and Anthony Braxton, the latter of whom I was lucky enough to work with while studying in the US. So what does the freedom in free improvisation make possible, we could ask? And what does it make difficult in the process? To misquote Perling, if free improv makes everything possible, what things of interest does it make not easy? To this, one might answer, certain kinds of structures and musical forms, coordination of a variety of musical elements, and complex communication, at least where extra musical communication is necessary or expedient. So I'm thinking, for example, the sorts of things that are very hard to do, they're very easy to do in a scored piece. For instance, have everybody do something at exactly the same time, and are hard to do when you don't have a plan. So the response of musicians such as Braxton to this problem was to create game and system pieces, or in some cases just systems, which combined fixed materials like musical notation, for example, in a traditional sense, or not so traditional sense, tool sets for creating performances, individual and collective, and that might mean directed improvisation strategies, and intervention mechanisms which might overcome the limits of individual taste and imagination. The primary innovation of our work with beer, then, has been to recognize that computer networks, in our case a network of improvising live coders, are intervention mechanisms par excellence. They are capable of instantaneous and highly complex communication, musical, extra-musical, and otherwise. They can impose forms on a performance and implement structure-creating devices. A typical beer piece, then, might involve a plan for improvisation that is at least partially controlled, i.e. delimited, structured, enabled, through some exchange of data or messages between the coder's computers. In our work Switchblade, for example, individual performers each live code 3 layers with loosely defined characteristics, such as noisy or rhythmic, which have been agreed in advance. An algorithm, itself live coded by one of the musicians, controls which layers of which performers are heard and when. So you can hear various things coming in and out there. It's a slightly different kind of perspective from the normal thing of improvising, because as a performer, you don't know when what you're doing is going to be heard. In another piece, called Piece Stew, the network itself is sonified. Each performer sends their audio signal to all of the others, who are free to mix them in different proportions, creating varying feedback loops that, once seeded with an audio signal, form resonators which sound of their own accord. So basically, if you can think of this room as a resonator, I make sound, the sound reflects back, we hear reverb in the space. Imagine a computer network and we're sending sound out between computers and it's coming back, and so that will eventually ring like a pitch, just like a flute would or a plucked string or anything like that. So performers live code to manipulate and process the sound at their node in the network, creating what is in effect a collective instrument which no individual can control. I used to describe playing this as like pushing on a huge blob of jelly. One can create ripples in the sound, but you can't really control the overall shape. Which is really interesting, I think, kind of alternative to the normal, perhaps very virtuosic idea of improvisation in which individual expression is valorized, right? It just completely undermines that. Okay. Such pieces pose an interesting challenge. Oh, yes, the traditional notion of a piece of music. This is what I get for ad-libbing against my notes. What is the identity of such pieces, which in many cases have no fixed form, although they perhaps contain formal mechanisms, and no prescribed content? What makes such pieces themselves? The answer is that the piece is, in a general sense, the system. Well, that particular ontology of an artwork is not in itself unique by any means. The use of a computer network as the primary medium for realizing it is perhaps a relatively recent innovation, and not without political implications in a broad sense. At the risk of waxing too romantic, I would go so far as to suggest that the network systems we used are a metaphor for what we became and did as an ensemble. Together, we founded a collective practice of improvisation, constrained by a society, in a sense. Beer can be understood in some sense as an exploration of possibilities and limits of different types of musical societies. Our work is not unique in this, of course, but is, I would argue, challenging in its range, and perhaps both utopian and somehow authoritarian in its use of technological mediation. The code library that I and others wrote to support this work is rather cheekily called Utopia. Thus, our approach to the problem of what next after free improv takes the form of a Rousseauian proposition, wherein the constraints imposed by a network system serve as a kind of social contract, the limitations of which enable new freedoms by solving collective action problems, to steal a term from political philosophy and economics. And it's maybe, it might help to make that clear, just to kind of reflect on the debates that we've had over the last few years about what freedom means And freedom has often, I think, been posited as some sort of absolute thing that means you can do whatever you want. Whereas other people, and if this comes into the context of things like whether or not people should be vaccinated or whether they should wear masks, we would, perhaps contrast that with another idea where we have a kind of social contract where we agree to restrict our freedoms in some way for collective benefit because it makes us all better off. Maybe that's clear, but that's what I mean by a collective action problem. And, topically enough, in recent years, our work has also embraced, out of something like necessity given the limitations of the pandemic, wide area as well as local networks, by which obviously I mean the internet. Through this, we have explored the technical possibilities and limitations of online collaboration at a distance. A personal favorite moment of mine was when I was given the chance to live code music for a MIDI controllable pipe organ in Sweden as part of an online concert. It seemed almost absurd that the resources existed for me to remote control an incredibly expensive physical instrument in a concert hall in another country for an audience that was not even present. But that's probably not the strangest experience that anybody had in the pandemic. So this was actually from the festival last year. Oh, you can see my lockdown beard there. I was slightly appalled by it when I put the presentation together, but I thought, Okay. Anyway. Okay. So to go on and talk about maybe another kind of network, if you like, that has played an important role in what I do, it would have to do with the complicated interactions that arise between tunings and collections of pitches, both in my work involving instruments and my electronic music. In my recent research plans, I've arrived at a way of referring to these using the somewhat pretentious term modal intonational topologies. That's a real AHRC grant application kind of phrase. This is supposed to be a general rather than a specialist talk, so I apologize for mentioning that. But what this means is the way in which a particular set of pitches interacts with a particular tuning to create a kind of landscape of high and low points or a network of hierarchies. I guess this is kind of a fancy way of saying I like non-standard tunings and scales. Now, I think no serious inaugural talk would be complete without at least a little blasphemy against the sacred cows of the field. So in an earnest attempt to annoy as many people as possible, I'm going to offer up 3 bits of it, which I hope may be offensive to electroacoustic composers, instrumental composers working in the post-war avant-garde tradition, and members of the general public in turn. These are all complaints against 3 different kinds of musical flattening, which I'll explain in a moment. Now, of course, in life, we are often disappointingly less provocative than we might fashion ourselves, and cultural matters can be more complicated and less absolute on the ground than we might like to think. Suffice it to say that I am probably aware of any obvious objections and exceptions to the claims I'm about to make that might occur to you. But even if they lack important nuance, strong statements can be instructive and also fun. So, here goes. Much electroacoustic music, with its strong emphasis on timbre, by which I mean sound quality. So for those who are not music people, we would say, timbre is, for example, what makes an A on an oboe sound different from an A on a piano. With its strong emphasis on timbre as the main carrier of musical discourse, much electroacoustic music, because of this, misses the trick by eschewing pitch as a significant element. Perceivable pitch, of course, occurs in much of this music, but it's often treated as somehow neutral or just another sound. This is the same error I feel the experimental composer John Cage, known for advocating that any sound could be musical, made when he said that the dominant 7th chord, the very crux of Western harmony, was as welcome in his new music as anything else. He meant by this that it was, again, just another sound. This is, in a sense, I think, a category error, as it flattens distinctions between musical material and ignores any cultural significance. It denies material any special status. But the listeners, especially non-insiders, may well not ignore these aspects. I think at best pieces which make this mistake deny themselves the rich culturally ingrained potential of musical pitch, and at worst undermine their own effectiveness by ignoring it. This attitude is perhaps related to the thinking of Pierre Schaeffer, one of the founding figures of the French approach to electroacoustic composition, who so emphasized the importance of timbre that he felt it necessary to exclude the cultural references, i.e. the extra musical meaning of sounds. Ironically, most of his errors, have to a significant extent ignored this advice and exploited a spectrum between abstract and recognizable sound to great and profound artistic effect, in my opinion. In the case of pitch, a rich musical meaning is in theory issued, and while it is true that there is, again, much electroacoustic music that does not do this, the issue seems under-discussed in the discourse, and it is a bit of a blind spot to my mind. So that's number one. Number two, much instrumental music composed in the Western classical tradition since the Second World War misses a trick with its rejection of the rich possibilities of hierarchical mode. Loosely speaking, we could describe this as scales, though perhaps it could be unusual ones. To be clear, atonal music in the post-Schoenbergian tradition offered rich new expressive possibilities, in particular the means to explore a wider and fuller range of human experiences. I'm thinking here of works that are usually characterized as expressionist and which dealt with rather dark topics. But the removal of pitch hierarchy that came with the dominance of what were called serial and post-serial practices was another kind of flattening. The group of composers associated with the Darmstadt summer courses, with their concept of restarting musical culture at year zero, went even further and rejected the expressionist associations that Schoenberg and co. had worked hard to legitimize. Of course, again, the exceptions to this attitude amongst contemporary classical composers are numerous, but an aversion to anything that might amount to hierarchical pitch schemes was still prevalent enough when I was studying that it was a seminal realization for me that not only was this attitude oppressive, and in its worst a form of cultural bullying, it was also in its narrow-mindedness denying an entire landscape of musical possibilities. Far from being reactionary or a return to the past, exploring the possibilities of hierarchical pitch organization in a post-tonal world was an underexploited opportunity. Are we angry yet? I will take questions at the end, or condemnations. Number three, the dominance of the standard Western equal-tempered tuning, in short, in which there are 12 possible notes in an octave, so 12 notes between C and the next higher C, and in which these are equally spaced notes, in addition to being a probably regrettable carrier of cultural hegemony, misses a trick by ignoring the possibilities that other approaches to tuning might afford us. The usual reason that is given for the adoption of equal temperament is that with the historical development of harmony in the Western sense, it was considered important that music be able to modulate to any possible key. Because of this, we adopted this flattened tuning, effectively ensuring that all notes and all keys are equally out of tune at all times. Now, more on the tricky notion of what in-tuneness might mean in a moment. The technical limitations imposed by the musical instruments of the time perhaps made this necessary or desirable, but it's increasingly unnecessary in the work that I do. Electronic music can be tuned any way one likes, and with a bit of care and forethought, instrumental performers can also practically realize other forms of tuning as well. In short, I see no reason why conventions serve as a barrier here, especially when that convention is so exclusionary of musical possibilities and indeed other musical cultures. So that's the three. So my journey into this kind of blasphemy, if you like, was a gradual one, and I approached these conclusions from multiple directions, more tangents, if you like. Some pieces I've written explored the addition of microtones, notes between those of the equal-tempered system, as well as pitch bends and slides as a way of creating acoustic effects, such as the beating effects that happen as closely spaced notes are detuned together. You'll hear some of that in the premiere later this evening if you come to the concert. In other works, I explored different scales and tunings, some derived from acoustic theory, such as scales based on the harmonic series. Roughly, for people who don't know, these are notes whose frequencies are derived from whole number ratios of pitches, so 2 times the frequency, 3 times the frequency. And these, in approximation, actually form the core of our perception of pitched timbres or pitch sounds. Other pieces used more synthetic scales of my devising. A current work in progress for the Bangkok-based Tassetti ensemble supplements a Thai-like scale, which is Thai scales are theoretically have 7 equally spaced pitches to the octave, although in practice it varies fairly widely. And it supplements that, my piece supplements that with in-between notes, allowing me to occasionally undermine the kind of rootlessness of the equal spacing to give emphasis to particular notes through nearby motion. Recently, I also had the opportunity to improvise with a group of musicians in Thailand, including both Western-trained and traditional performers, working around electronically synthesized textures involving similar tuning schemes. My experience here has been enriched in many ways by the opportunity to experience musics of other cultures, in some cases as a participant. This gave me not only a broader experience of other modes and tunings, and of other kinds of approaches to pitch hierarchies, but also of the whole idea of being in tune itself. While learning Javanese gamelan music, I had the opportunity to study the rebab, this kind of two-string spike fiddle with the renowned performer I.M. Harjito. There's Pak Harjito there. This was an absolutely unbelievably lucky turn of affairs for me, and sort of roughly equivalent to taking up the cello and getting beginner lessons with Rostropovich or something like this. It's absurd, actually, kind of absurd accident of history, really. Now, the strings of the rebab are tuned to the purest of perfect fifths, but in one of the modes, they are at least a semitone, so for those of you who aren't musicians, that's a whole piano key, higher than the equivalent notes in the rest of the ensemble, which probably from a Western sensibility seems extremely strange. When I was first learning this, I asked how sharp the note should be, and I was told, sharper than you think. This was the beginning of my understanding of a music in which being in tune meant something really very different to what I had been taught. In-tuneness was different for different notes in different modes, and varied depending on the musical context and what part you were performing. Indeed, the tuning itself was not standardized and varied between sets of instruments, depending on perhaps the acoustic properties of the instruments, their historical provenance, and I'd imagine taste as well. But in the end, this helped me to arrive at a more profound idea of tuning itself. I'm grateful to my friend, the violinist Mira Benjamin, herself an expert on tuning, for introducing me to both her thinking and that of the late Bob Gilmore, who said, "Tuning is to music as focus is to photography." They have led me to an understanding of tuning as a way of listening, which defines a space of relations within an activity of sounding. So tuning is a kind of it's something you do. It's not a thing that kind of exists. It's an activity and a way of listening and thinking. Perhaps unsurprisingly, some of my explorations of tuning have led me into the realm of cultural exchange, a process I have met with a mix of trepidation and deep affection, and I hope also respect. My work, which you can hear a bit of here, for the wonderful Fidelio Trio, is called Head, Neck, Chest 4, 5, 6 Thing, makes use of an adapted version of the Javanese pelog tuning, and is named after one way of translating the names of its notes. And what a wonderful tuning it is. It fails spectacularly to be represented approximately within Western equal temperament, and it comes with these sort of wonderful ambiguities, and there's a sort of surprising, almost modal shift that the introduction of the note 4 seems to entail, and it has with this sort of insistent uniqueness that almost seems outside the scale. So for me, writing this piece was a kind of affirmation of my love for this music, for the diverse and giving international community that surrounds it. I mean, gamelan, people say Beethoven's an international music. Gamelan is an international music. There's gamelans all over the world, right? And as a kind of thanks for what that has taught me. And that's Dara Morgan doing his best rebab impression. I'll move more quickly now through the remaining sections. Here in Birmingham, I've had the chance to work with a number of extraordinary local artists. One of these projects, with the artist Tassawar Bashir, also involved aspects of cross-cultural exchange, and has led to an ongoing series of works relating to the Sufi devotional music, Qawwali. This music has an important history in Birmingham, as it was arguably here that this music made the leap from a shrine practice to becoming an international phenomenon when Oriental Star Agencies brought Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and his group, who you can see here, to Birmingham to perform for immigrant workers from Asia. So the first stage of this project was based around a famous bootleg video, which again you can see here, of just such a performance at the Luxor Cinema in Basel Heath. Together with a group of composers, Tass and I created a kind of musical palimpsest on this recording, combining it with other materials from OSA, in a kind of radical collaboration between the group of participants and this important musical document from the history of the city. Co-composition is unusual in the classical music and electroacoustic worlds, but we found it a rewarding process. Latter stages of this project involved workshopping sessions with the local Asian community, which were absolutely wonderful, the feedback we got and interactions. That was in collaboration with Sampad South Asian Arts, and also exploratory work with younger Qawwali musicians from Pakistan. Later, Tass and I were asked by the university to provide sound to accompany the touring exhibition of the Birmingham Quran, I think probably because people were aware of this project, which was a really quite humbling and amazing opportunity to have. Another project with local artist Anne Perauti, who's in the audience there, was entitled Kelp Road. And this led to both a sound installation and a concert piece on sort of my side of things. These were based on field recordings that Anne and I and her brother made on a number of trips to North Wales. These were made both above and below the water simultaneously sometimes. And on a series of trips, we kind of worked on these, and also in collaboration with engineer Tim Collins, who used to be in the university that's moved on to Manchester. We managed to create a kind of underwater multi-channel hydrophone array that allowed us to record surround sound underwater, so capturing directional spatial sound from underwater. The sound that I created accompanied Anne's beautiful contact cyanotypes of kelp that she had selected from around the UK, which you can see some in this video here. I wish I could say a lot more about that. Anne's work is absolutely fantastic. And together we told a story about the region and how it fit into the broader patterns of ecology and sounding. All of which brings me, I suppose, to the elephant in the room, or maybe the elephant that is the room, given where we are right now, which is the question of space. Like my fondness for field recordings, I probably get my obsession for this from my teacher, Barry Truax. Given my enthusiasm, you can imagine what opportunities are presented to me by Beast, our circa 100 loudspeaker concert system for electronic music, which you can hear downstairs, as well as from systems like the one you see around you. And there's more and more of these kind of around the world as time goes on. But field recordings as a musical element show us how this is about more than just technical affordances. A recording of an underwater soundscape or of stones from a Swedish beach does something that a violin cannot, or at least not as easily. It gives us access to another place. With setups like this, we can present sound that is different from a tune or an agent making a sounding action. We can create whole environments, realistic, abstract, or any mix. We can blur the lines between them and sound out within them. This possibility still compels me to make art nearly 30 years after I first discovered it. Much of my electroacoustic work has focused around various aspects of this. And if you come to the final concert in the festival on Friday, you'll hear a short example of this in the form of a small bit of fun called Beastly Fanfare. That was the first initial example of a line of work. Here's another example that explored possibilities and techniques for composing for large-scale multi-channel audio systems, of which Beast is, of course, a fine example. As a practice, this does come with some issues, such as renewed questions of institutional access and portability of pieces from one system to another. In doing this work, by the way, I made my only attempts ever really to coin new terms, such as massively multi-channel and N-channel works. Both of these seem to have been failures so far, so if you could repeat them frequently to each other for the rest of the festival, I'd be very grateful. On top of this, I've been involved in more general research around software tools and presentation strategies for Beast, most notably the performance software that we use, which I wrote with Sergio Luca, with input from John T. Harrison and many, many beasties over the years. I must say that though I find Oscar Wilde's affirmation of art as useless appealing, if not completely convincing, it has been a great joy to create things that are of some use to others. And I should also stress, by the way, that that other joy that we call teaching, especially when it comes to so-called research students, which I find a very funny phrase, is really the communal joy of learning from and teaching each other. To have this in my life is a great privilege and something I'm constantly thankful for. And I should say that Beast has really been particularly fantastic for fostering that kind of community. Though perhaps coming out of a sort of modernist tradition, if I can say the M word, which valorizes individual expression, Beast enables this expression through collective action and support. It takes a lot of people to put up all those speakers. Though sometimes referred to as a research center, or just a lot of speakers, it's much more than that. It's a kind of network in society, again. Beast is people, really, I think, and what people become when they work together. So, some clever wag once suggested that the actor and latter-day politician Arnold Schwarzenegger's talent lay not so much in his own acting skills, but rather in surrounding himself with really talented and brilliant people who had the ability to make him look as good as possible. Suffice it to say, identify. As an example, here's Arnold seen with the, in my opinion, much more talented Grace Jones, admittedly not doing her best work, but there you go. Without people like, for example, James McCartney, who initially wrote Super Collider, John T., who gave me such wonderful friendship and guidance. Colleagues here, past and present, really just too many to mention, and of course the students, so I think I'd rather call them my partners in crime. Without them, I won't say I couldn't have done it. That's actually true, of course, but I suppose I would have just done other things. But I do feel like my life has been so much richer because of all these people and all they've given me. And again, I've come to believe in the value of collaboration in the deepest and profoundest sense, and through that have become suspicious of traditional role definitions such as composer, performer, technician, administrator. We come together to make music, better music than we could alone, and that's what I want to do. So, how to conclude? Is there a path amongst the diversions? Maybe. There are certainly meeting points where they link and overlap. I can see patterns and networks analogous in pitches, music systems, communities. I can see cycles of interest that return. The composer Luc Ferrari, in an article that I freely acknowledge as an inspiration for this talk, spoke of cycles like individuals, living at different speeds. When they didn't meet, they were independent. When they met by the phenomenon of different beats, they were transformed by influence or by confrontation. This makes sense to me as a guidance for living an artistic life. But all of this remains hard to quantify, and I still worry that what I do doesn't fit so easily into ideas of style or oeuvre or grand theories. But what is style in experimental music anyway? Much of whatever unique contribution to knowledge I have made is perhaps, as I said in the beginning, embodied in the music itself. I don't know if such knowledge as music is useful, or perhaps better useless in the Wildean sense, but I am reminded of something Anthony Braxton would say to me when parting. So before you go off for a very hard-earned glass of wine, I'll say the same to all of you, especially the very many of you who have meant so much to me in my work. Thank you for your music, and I thank you all for listening.